One of the most famous Catholic authors of the 20th century is Flannery O'Connor, a Southern girl who wrote about her experiences of growing up in the South and her Catholic faith, and put them into a whole series of short stories, essays, and writings. And Flannery O'Connor's writings are interesting in that she herself would describe them as grotesque, that she purposefully uses imagery and signs and people and characters that cause you maybe to shrink back a little bit by their appearance or by their behavior. Kind of carnival-esque or freak show-esque in a sense. But she did so because she felt that people really needed to be shocked by God's grace today. Because in Flannery's mind, she describes God's grace as violent. God's grace really is violent. It pours out to us from flesh that has been ripped apart on a cross, through a side that has been torn open by a lance, through a back that has been shredded by a whip. That grace pours out from that cross, and it is a violent act. And it is that grace that comes to us. The reason I thought about Flannery, one of her stories reminded me, or the readings today made me think of this story. A short story called A Good Man's Hard to Find, written in 1953. And in that story, she tells the tale of a family who's driving south to find this old house that grandmother remembers. And grandmother is about as proper a Southern belle as you can find. And she has got every little piece of her clothing in perfect place, and her hat tipped just the right way, and her speech and her mannerisms are what she thinks is perfect. But as you read the story, you begin to find out that Grandma's kind of a nasty woman. Because all she does is tears at people, and fights at them, and judges, and makes them feel bad, and so on and so forth. But everything is so proper. She's a lady. Well, it turns out that the family car ends up in an accident, partly due to Grandma's doings. And when the car is rendered undrivable, and they get out and are standing on this road, they see this large black car driving down the way, and three guys get out, all packing heat. And when they approach this family that's stranded, the two henchmen begin taking members of the family out into the woods, and you hear the shots fired. And it leaves Grandma there, all alone, face to face, with the head of this band. His name, what he's called the Misfit in the story. And as she pleads with him to save her life, her reasoning that she should be spared is because he's a good man. You're a good man, because clearly a good man would never shoot a lady. And I'm a lady. And in her conversation with him, they eventually get around to talking about Jesus. And she sees that he struggles with the concept and the miracles of Jesus. And in that moment, something happens in her as she looks at the struggle on his face and the battle between good and evil in him. And all of a sudden, she recognizes that she's looking into a mirror. That she sees herself as that person. That she recognizes in that moment that while he may be outwardly evil, she is inwardly evil. And as she kind of is flustered, her prim and proper hat falls off her head, and she reaches out and lays her hand on the side of his face, and basically says, I recognize, you're one of my children. You're me. And he backs away from her and fires 3 bullets into her heart. She dies with a smile on her face. And the henchman stands there, or the guy stands there as his 2 henchmen come back, and he says to them, this woman would have been a good woman her whole life, if only there was someone there to shoot her every minute of her life. That's Flannery O'Connor in a nutshell. She would have been a good woman if she would have come face to face with her mortality. If she would have come face to face with the reality of who she was and not who she was pretending to be, she would have been a good woman. But she found salvation. In that last moment, she recognized. She recognized that she was a sinner, that she was that murderer in many ways, and she died at peace with a smile on her face. Violent grace. That grace comes crashing into our lives, not necessarily the way we would have wanted, but the way God desired. And the reason I thought about this is because there's a lot of talk, I think, in a world right now that's so divided and so contentious and so trying to figure things out that even bleeds into our Christian faith. And there are so many Christians and so many Catholics who ask the very question that Jesus was posed today. In a world of such unfaithfulness, will hell be full? Are few going to be saved? What's happening? And in some sense, I think there's a certain current that want that to be true, that want hell to be full, and want to find themselves in heaven based on their own righteousness. Well, I lived my life, I was good, or so on and so forth. But it kind of makes me angry when I hear that, when the question is asked, will hell be full? Will heaven be empty? It makes me angry, I think, the way Jesus was angry today. And we go back to the Old Testament to find our key. Because the Lord sets Israel before him in that first reading. And he says, "Oh, Israel, you think you're so faithful. Well, why don't you sit over there? And I'm going to parade all of the nations before you. I'm going to load up the peoples from those unfaithful countries who don't even know my name. I'm going to put them on dromedaries, and I'm going to load them up on those elephants, and I'm going to walk them in front of you into the holy city. And you can like it, or you can love it. Because I'm going to say who I darn well please want to say. I'm going to bring the nations in to profess the holiness of my name. Don't think you have that as your commodity." And so when Jesus is faced with this question, Lord, will only a few be saved? He doesn't answer the question. Rather, he throws a challenge at them. Try to enter the narrow gate. Just try. And you will find that many are trying, and they are not strong enough. And you will find yourself outside when the door has been locked because you tried to get in yourself. Jesus wants us to know that nobody gets into his house unless he not only opens the door, but lets them in. He is the only one that lets us into salvation. Grace is what saves us. Grace is what we need. We look at the world like this woman in Flannery O'Connor's story, and at some point we have to realize also the violence of God's grace. That it must crash upon us and dishevel us so that we recognize, I am that sinner. I am the one that I think should be cast outside. I'm the one that needs to be let in. And no matter how much I pray, or how much I practice, or how much I do anything, that's not going to get me in. Lord, we ate and drank at your table. We talked about you. We heard you teaching in our streets. I don't know you. We cannot get in by our own efforts. It's God's grace and a violent movement of grace that brings us in. It was that violent moment of grace that brought that woman in O'Connor's story to salvation in the final minute of her life. And she was saved. God, I think, wants all of us to be saved. He doesn't want hell to be full. That doesn't mean there isn't one. There clearly is a hell. There clearly is, we should be afraid of that eternal separation from God. We should be afraid of that reality. We know that we can choose to be there by our sinful actions and our turning away from God. We know that. But we also know God doesn't intend any of his children to be there. And St. Paul's letter reminds us of that today when he says, I want to call all of you my sons. I want you all to be my children. Now, if God looks at us and sees a child, think about your own life. Would you want your own child in eternal damnation? No. And God is so much better than we are. God will bend over backwards to save us. God did bend over backwards to save us. That violent act of grace saves us. So whether or not we practice our faith so diligently, or whether we find ourselves in a state where we're kind of sort of on again, off again, whatever, each of us realize that I have to keep my eyes fixed on Christ and find Him as my salvation. When Peter was walking with Jesus at the end of Jesus' time on earth, John was following behind. And Jesus had just revealed to Peter that he was going to eventually be crucified and die for Christ. And Peter turned around and saw John and was like, but Lord, what about him? And what did the Lord say? Don't you worry about him. You worry about yourself. Don't be asking about someone else's salvation. I'll take care of that. You follow me. You follow me. We do that because we know that we have been saved by Christ. We don't come here today because we were doing good things. We come here today to be saved. And we know we are saved in Jesus Christ. And as St. Paul says, now as his children, we have to suffer a little bit. We have to suffer. Because as Christ suffered to save us, now we who are his body will suffer to save the nations. It's going to be by our participation in Christ's sacrifice that brings the nations and those who need salvation brought in. And just in case you think I'm spouting nonsense, or that, oh, Father, just something little priest saying everyone's getting into heaven, don't you worry. I want to pull out the church's own handbook on indulgences and read you what I think is the most beautiful gift of God's mercy that the church offers to us. If a priest cannot be present at the moment of one's death, Holy Mother Church lovingly grants such persons who are rightly disposed a plenary indulgence, that is full remission of sin and entrance into heaven, to be obtained at the moment of death, provided they regularly prayed in some way during their lifetime. Doesn't say that they were perfect Catholics. Doesn't say that they never made a mistake, that they were at this table every Sunday, that they were perfect in their charity. If a person was open to being saved at the moment of their death and had some relationship with Christ, then the church will suffer for that person to bring them to salvation. That's what we do. And that's why we're here. We're here to save people, not to condemn them. We will suffer for the world so that we don't have to ask that question, will hell be full? Rather, we should ask the question, how many people can I cram into heaven?